Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I love hearing the names of the cities and towns where my stories reach. That afternoon began like any other, with the warm glow of sunlight stretching across my living room floor and the faint hum of the ceiling fan spinning lazily above. I was in the middle of sorting through a stack of old magazines when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief moment I considered ignoring it. But curiosity has a way of tugging at you until you give in. When I opened the door, there stood Ethan, my friend Marjorie's son. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. The last time we'd met, it was at Marjorie's summer barbecue, where he'd helped carry trays of food with that quiet, understated politeness that made him stand out among the noisy crowd. Today he looked a little older, a little taller, and there was something in his eyes, a calm confidence that caught me off guard. "Hi, Mrs. Lane," he said with an easy smile, shifting a backpack off one shoulder. "Mom asked me to drop off this book you lent her." I stepped aside to let him in, the familiar scent of early autumn wafting in with him. There was a slight chill in the air outside, but inside my home was warm, cozy, and filled with that lived-in comfort only years can give. I noticed how his gaze wandered, not in a prying way, but like someone taking in details they'd missed before. We chatted at first about small things, how school was going, how his part-time job at the hardware store was treating him. He seemed genuinely interested when I told him about my latest project in the garden, asking questions that felt more thoughtful than the casual curiosity of someone his age. There was a quiet attentiveness about him, the kind you don't often encounter, and it drew me in. After a while, I offered him some tea, and we settled into the living room. The light from the window framed his face as he listened to me tell a story about how Marjorie and I had met decades ago. He laughed in all the right places, but there were moments he'd just watch me, like my words were something he wanted to remember. There was nothing hurried about his presence. It was as if the world outside had paused, giving us this small pocket of time to share without interruption. Somewhere in that quiet exchange, I felt the lines blur between an ordinary visit and something a little more memorable. Not because anything grand happened, but because of the way he seemed to see me, not just as his mother's friend, but as a person with stories, thoughts, and a life of my own. When he finally stood to leave, the late afternoon sun had shifted, casting the room in golden light. He handed me the empty teacup, his fingers brushing mine just briefly. So light, it might have been accidental, yet lingering in my thoughts as the door clicked shut behind him. I didn't realize until much later that evening, as I replayed our conversation, that I'd been left with a memory I wouldn't soon forget. Not because of any dramatic gesture, but because it was one of those rare, quiet moments when someone sees you clearly, and you see them too. The next morning, I found myself lingering over my coffee a little longer than usual, the warmth of the mug in my hands matched only by the lingering warmth of yesterday's conversation. It wasn't that Ethan had said anything particularly unusual. It was the way he'd been present, the way he'd listened as if every word mattered. That sort of attentiveness had been missing from my life for a while. Marjorie had mentioned once that Ethan was different from other boys his age, more thoughtful, more grounded. I'd taken it as the proud words of a mother, but now I could see she hadn't been exaggerating. Still, I reminded myself he was young, and I had no reason to read too much into a friendly visit. Yet, as the day went on, little details from our time together kept bubbling to the surface. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the pause he took before answering questions, the gentle way he handled the teacup, almost like it was part of the conversation itself. By late afternoon, I decided to step out into the garden, thinking some fresh air might clear my mind. The air had the crisp bite of early autumn, the kind that makes the leaves look sharper against the sky. I knelt down to pull weeds from the flower bed when I heard the sound of footsteps on the path leading to my back gate. I looked up, a little startled, and there he was again. Ethan, this time without the excuse of returning a book. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said, leaning casually on the fence. "I was passing by and saw you out here. Thought I'd say hello." I wiped my hands on my gardening apron, smiling despite myself. "It's fine. I don't usually get visitors 2 days in a row." He stepped closer, eyes scanning the rows of flowers and the half-pruned rosebush. "You've got quite the garden here. Mom's tried to start one a few times, but she never sticks with it." We fell into an easy rhythm again, this time surrounded by the earthy smell of soil and the quiet rustle of leaves overhead. I showed him the stubborn hydrangeas that refused to bloom, and he laughed, offering to help with the heavier pruning. Without hesitation, he took the clippers from me and began working beside me. His sleeves rolled up, revealing the lean strength in his arms. It wasn't lost on me how naturally he fit into the scene, like he'd always been part of it. We talked about everything from books to music to the places we both wanted to visit someday. He told me about a hiking trip he'd taken with friends over the summer, how the quiet of the mountains had made him feel like he could hear his own thoughts more clearly. I found myself sharing things I didn't often tell people, small dreams, old regrets, and the odd comfort of solitude. He listened, never rushing me, never interrupting. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, he paused mid-sentence and looked at me in a way that made the world feel suddenly smaller. It wasn't an intense gaze, not in the way you'd expect, but there was a softness there, an understanding that felt rare. I looked away first, pretending to fuss with the roses, but the moment stayed between us like an unspoken sentence neither of us was ready to say aloud. When it was time for him to leave, he hesitated at the gate, hands resting on the latch. "I'll see you around, Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice light but with a trace of something else, something that made me wonder if this was just a coincidence or if he had sought me out for reasons even he hadn't fully defined. That night, lying in bed, I could still feel the quiet weight of his presence in the garden. There was no plan for what this connection was or wasn't supposed to be, but something told me this wasn't the last time I'd see him. And in the stillness of my room, I realized I didn't want it to be. 2 days passed without a sign of him, and I told myself I was glad for it. It gave me time to steady my thoughts, to let the garden encounter fade into the background of everyday life. But if I'm being honest, every creak of the front gate or hum of footsteps outside made my heart pick up just a little faster. I kept busy, cleaning out the pantry, writing emails, even baking a batch of scones I hadn't planned on making. Yet my mind wandered back to the sound of his voice and the way the late sunlight had caught in his hair. It was late afternoon on the 3rd day when I heard it, the familiar knock on the front door, firm but not hurried. I opened it to find Ethan again, this time holding a small brown paperback. "Brought you something," he said, his smile easy, though there was something in his eyes that looked like he'd been hoping I'd open the door. Inside the bag was a jar of homemade honey, the golden liquid catching the light. "My friend's family keeps bees," he explained. "I thought you might like it with your tea." It was such a simple gesture, but it felt unexpectedly personal. I invited him in, and we settled once more in the living room, tea steaming between us. The honey was rich and floral, and I told him so. He grinned, pleased in that quiet way of his, and leaned back in the chair, letting the conversation wander wherever it wanted to go. We talked about books again, this time more deeply, about characters that linger long after you've closed the last page. He told me about a novel he'd read recently, where 2 people meet by chance and change each other's lives without realizing it until much later. "It's strange," he said, "how some connections feel like they've always been there, even if they've only just started." The way he said it made my chest tighten. I could feel the air shift, that subtle current that comes when words carry more weight than they seem to on the surface. I didn't know if he meant it as anything more than a reflection on the book, but it stayed with me all the same. At one point, he noticed the stack of old photographs on the side table. Without asking, he leaned forward and began looking through them, smiling at the faded colors and curled edges. "You look happy in this one," he said, holding up a picture of me in my 20s, standing barefoot on a beach. I admitted, feeling the pull of that memory. That was a long time ago. He studied the picture for a moment longer before setting it down gently. "You still have that same smile," he said softly, as if it were a fact and not a compliment. The conversation drifted after that, but the quiet between us wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that feels comfortable, like a shared blanket on a cool evening. Eventually, he glanced at the clock and said he should go, but he didn't move right away. Instead, he looked around the room as though memorizing it, and then back at me, as though trying to read something in my face. When he finally rose, I walked him to the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned to me. "Thanks for the tea," he said, then hesitated before adding, "I like talking with you. It's different." I stood there for a moment after he left, the door still half open, the cool breeze carrying in the scent of autumn leaves. Different. That was the word he'd chosen. And as much as I tried to tell myself it was just a friendly remark, part of me knew that what was happening between us, whatever it was quietly deepening, in ways neither of us had named yet. That night, I poured myself another cup of tea and drizzled in the honey he brought. The sweetness lingered long after the cup was empty, just like the feeling he left behind every time he visited. A week later, life had slipped into its usual rhythm again, or at least, that's what I told myself. But the truth was, something in my days felt subtly altered. Morning coffee didn't taste the same without the possibility of hearing a knock at the door. My walks through the garden seemed quieter without a second pair of footsteps crunching the gravel. I missed the way his conversations seemed to stretch time, making an hour feel like something much more precious. It was on a cool, overcast Saturday afternoon that the unexpected happened. I was in the kitchen, mixing batter for a loaf of banana bread, when I heard the soft rattle of the front gate. The sound was unmistakable, Ethan. I found myself brushing flour off my hands more quickly than necessary, my pulse matching the quickening patter of the rain beginning outside. He stood there on the porch, damp from the drizzle, his hair slightly tousled by the wind. "Hi," he said, almost shyly. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in. I stepped aside, and he came in, shaking off the chill. The scent of rain followed him into the room, mingling with the warm, sweet smell of the bread baking in the oven. Without much discussion, we ended up in the living room again, the steady drum of rain against the windows wrapping the house in a cocoon of calm. We spoke about small things at first, his classes, my plans for the week, but soon the conversation shifted. He told me about feeling caught between where he was and where he wanted to be in life, about wanting to do something meaningful, but not knowing exactly what that was yet. There was an openness in his voice, an unguarded honesty I rarely heard from anyone, let alone someone his age. I found myself sharing pieces of my own past, choices I'd made, roads I'd turned away from, and the moments I'd doubted myself. Not in the way of giving advice, but in offering my truth, hoping he might find something in it that resonated. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, as if he were storing away every word. The rain kept falling, soft and constant. At one point, he reached for the jar of honey still on the side table, the one he brought weeks ago. He turned it in his hands before looking at me with a quiet smile. "I'm glad I came by that day," he said. "I didn't know I needed these talks, but I do." There was a warmth in my chest I couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and a bittersweet awareness that moments like these are fleeting. We sipped tea, the banana bread cooling on the counter, the scent filling the air like an unspoken comfort. As evening approached, the rain finally began to ease, and the fading light made the room feel softer, almost like it was exhaling. He stood to leave, and I walked him to the door. On the porch, he paused, looking out at the wet street before turning to me. "I'll be heading back to school soon," he said, a note of hesitation in his voice. "But I'll come by when I can." I nodded, trying to keep my smile steady. "You'll always be welcome here." He lingered for just a moment longer before stepping out into the damp air, his figure disappearing down the street. I closed the door slowly, my reflection caught in the glass for a second. Older now, yes, but with a softness in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. Later that night, I sliced a piece of the banana bread and drizzled it with the honey he'd given me. The flavor was deep, sweet, and lingering, just like the memory of him sitting across from me, talking as though time didn't matter. And I knew, without needing to define it, that his visits had left me with something I'd carry quietly in my heart. Not a grand love story, not even a chapter I could explain to anyone else, but a reminder of how unexpectedly someone can walk into your life and leave you seeing the world, and yourself, a little differently.